Okay, it's 8:05. Let's get started. So again, thank you all very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to the webinar tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Richard Lowe. I've lived in Singapore now for 29 years. I'm originally from Oxford, England. I've been involved in finance, real estate, developer finance, international project marketing for over 15 years now. And having been heavily involved with investing both personally in the UK and here in Singapore, I'd like to think for those of you tuning in, most of you I think are from Singapore. We have some in Malaysia as well. But hopefully I can bring the best of both worlds and perspectives of having lived pretty much half my life here in Asia and Singapore and half in the UK, and obviously been heavily involved with the industry for the last 15 years. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. There is a chat box down at the bottom right-hand side. So do, if you have any questions, sort of jot those in there, and I'll do my best to answer those at the end of the presentation tonight. So though, to make sure you have dialed into the right place, tonight's session, as you can see from the title, is the UK and London property market about to rebound? Now, the reason I wanted to take some time to share data and not just opinions, and especially internet sort of headline grabbing ways that people want to grab your eyeballs, but really sort of review what's been happening over the last few years, because I think it's fair to say that since interest rates went up, it certainly had a dampening effect on the UK property market. But it does look like there are some early signs of change. So the roadmap for today's webinar is I'm going to be presenting quite a lot of data just to share with you what seems to be happening in the market at the moment and trying to interpret some of that data to what could be happening over the next few years. So without further ado, let me get started. So for many of you, I'm sure you've traveled to the UK, been to the UK. It's obviously a very dynamic country, obviously close affiliation with both Singapore and Malaysia. Both countries share the same rule of law as the UK. But when we look at certain different aspects to the overall economy, and starting at the top left side, and real estate, the UK real estate market is the second most liquid and globally traded in the world after the USA. When it comes to transparency, JLL Global Real Estate ranks it #1 across the globe. When we look at pricing, track record, price appreciation, rental growth, it's always had very good, steady growth. It's not a country necessarily that you'll be becoming a millionaire overnight, but it's a very safe place to invest with good, steady growth in both capital growth as well as rental growth. For those of you living here in Singapore, over the years, the Singapore dollar relative to the pound sterling has got extremely strong, and it's very, very favorable exchange rate still. The UK is known for its talent and innovation in terms of different sort of industries that it's pioneered. From an education point of view, the UK has 4 of the top 8 ranked universities in the world, according to QS World University Rankings, and 17 in the top 100. And again, if people aren't studying in Singapore, one of the top places that people wish to aspire to study in is the UK for the quality of its universities and education. It has many established industries such as financial and professional services, and growth industries such as the science and technology have been growing hugely to the point where UK tech ecosystems employs 3 million people and is valued at over 1 trillion, according to Tech Nation. So we're going to look at London, but we're also going to look at the rest of the UK. But I'm going to share a lot about London as well, many people who've invested into the UK, it's very often the first city that they've invested into. So I wanted to spend some time on that, especially for those people who have invested. But as a city, it's one of the most dynamic, cosmopolitan cities in the world. In terms of sort of culture and attractions, it has over 200 West End shows every day, over 22,000 live performances every year, has 7 Premier League football clubs, over 300 languages spoken, 73 Michelin star restaurants, and over 1,000 museums, galleries, and UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So I'm sure all of you who've been to London know it as a great place, not only for business, but for culture and tourism as well. So when we look at global financial centers, London still leads the way in Europe. The sort of key financial cities of Europe are highlighted in the dark blue, and in the light brown we see the global financial centers. And so London is, you know, only eclipsed by New York. So university and education, again, is an important industry in itself, but something that is very attractive to further one's education. And we can see here the enrollments for overseas students going back to 2013, which pretty much every single year has continued to increase significantly. And this is in just London alone. Now, why is this important as a potential investor and landlord? Well, when we look at the pie chart on the top right, 23% or almost 25% of total tenants in London are made up of students. And 47% of those students who go on to graduate actually go on to live and work in London. So again, this is a very important sector when it comes to potential tenants. Now, very often an international student may be coming from a slightly wealthier family and maybe have a slightly higher disposable income to rent a nice property. But certainly when they graduate and get to a job, those tenants that were students potentially have greater disposable income, and again, are a very good source of potential tenancies. Now, this slide is just comparing some of the costs of not just acquiring, but holding and disposing of properties in different key cities around the world. And what we can see is when we look at London, we have a total estimation of cost relative to these other expenses of acquisition at about 12%. It's sad to see, but unfortunately Singapore, because of the additional buyer stamp duty, which I'll touch on a little bit later, for a foreign investor, is now looking at something like 65% of the cost of the property goes into acquisition costs. So when we look at the bar on the left, this is taking a property in a city like London, equivalent to a $1 million US purchase price. And what we can see is that the 3 costs that have been measured here is the buying costs in terms of those taxes. So that would be the stamp duty, the holding costs, which is really the income tax, and the selling cost. Now, there is a selling cost that would be the capital gains tax, but as you'll see at the line at the bottom, we're not actually factoring in capital gains here. The selling cost would be like the agent's fee when you are paying an agent to sell the property. But I think the big picture here is that the fact that when we look at key cities around the world and we look at the cost of purchasing, holding, and disposing of a property, it equates to about 12% of the actual purchase price, which relative to the other cities is certainly on the lower end of the scale. Now, I'm actually going to diverge slightly and give a little bit of a sneak preview to another webinar that I'll be doing later this year, which I have done once or twice in the past, which was really doing a comparison of Singapore and UK property and where is best to invest. really based on a foreign investor buying a second property. But just let's have a look at some of the acquisition costs here in Singapore. So we have something called basic stamp duty, and the column on the left shows the sliding scale depending on the purchase price of the basic stamp duty that you'll pay. So not too bad, you know, again, compared with certain other countries. But let's have a look also at some of the cooling measures that the government has brought in, which is referred to as ABSD, or Additional Buyer's Stamp Duty. In fact, in April of last year, it went up significantly again. So if we look at the top line here, the ABSD for a second property for a Singapore citizen, the stamp duty they'll pay is 20%, and on a third property, they're going to be paying 30%. If we jump down to the bottom line, the ABSD for a foreign investor, whether actually doesn't have to be necessary for investor, it could be a foreigner that's living in Singapore, or it could be a foreigner who's living outside of Singapore who wants to buy a property. The ABSD is 60%. So on $1 million property, you're going to be paying 600,000 as a foreigner to buy into a property here in Singapore. Now, the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, also dictates how much you can borrow from a bank. And the first line, when it says none, that's basically referring, it's not an investment property where you're renting it out to somebody else. Basically, this would be your prime residency. So one, it refers to your first investment property. And when you look at the LTV, or the loan to value, we can see there that on the left-hand side, the loan to value that you can get is a maximum of 45%. And on your next one, if it be your second investment property or your third property in total in Singapore, that LTV then drops down to 35%. And it actually drops down even further if you want to try and get a loan that's longer than 30 years, or goes, the loan term goes past the age, if you are of 65. So I'm just going to take a quick scenario. We'll take the snapshot of your first investment property with a 45% loan to value. So you're going to have to put a 55% deposit down. And if we took an example of an entry-level condominium in Singapore and make the assumption, which is not too distant from what it is actually, an entry-level property in Singapore being about 1 million Singapore dollars. So if you imagine you can only get a 45% loan on that, well, that means you're putting down 55% deposit, or 550,000 of cash onto that property. But on top of that, because it's your first investment property, a Singaporean would be actually paying an additional 20%, or another 200,000 on top of that 550,000. So for a Singaporean, they're going to be paying 750,000 of cash tied up to buy a 1 million property. If you're a foreigner, that 550,000 jumps to actually 1,150,000 to buy a 1 million property. Now, I share this because when we look at an entry-level property in somewhere like the UK, and we leverage and get a mortgage of about 70 to 75%, because of the lower ticket prices of the property in the UK, and the fact that we can still get, whether it's a second, third, fourth property, we could still get 70, 75% loan to value in principle. Roughly speaking, for every 100,000 Singapore dollars, you could buy one entry-level property in the UK. So if you think about it, for a Singapore citizen, if they were putting 750,000 into one investment property, that 750,000 could actually buy at least 7 properties. And when we look at the foreigner at 1,150,000, they could be looking up to 11 properties. So in effect, you could invest with the same amount of cash and gain a portfolio of, who knows, 7 to 11 properties, spread that risk, and probably have a portfolio that will be yielding more than you get here in Singapore. So anyway, that's food for thought, and it's a little bit of a teaser for an upcoming webinar that I'll be doing a little bit later this year. So going back into the main aspect and looking at London and the UK as a property market, here what we can see is different regions around the UK and the percentage of people in those regions who rent. And we can see on the right-hand side, the bar chart there shows London is just under 29% of properties are rented out. So significantly higher than any other region in the UK. And I really put this down to two main things. One, just the price of property is so much more expensive that for many people, buying a property is out of their reach, so they're forced to rent. And the fact that London has a very high number of foreigners, and very often, just like here in Singapore, the foreigners are the ones that definitely are also renting as well. Now here we can see, I'm going to focus on the orange line primarily, which is showing the annual change in achieved rents across London going back to 2018. And what we saw at the beginning of 2020 when COVID hit was there was very much a drop of rentals that went down anywhere from 20 to 30% across Greater London. And really the reason being was that people realized that now, for the best part of 2020, people were working from home. There was no need to be renting prime real estate, paying top rentals if I no longer need to be close to my office and convenience to go into work. But we do see by 2021, the rentals starting to climb. And we can see ever since there really has been an extremely strong rental market, where today we're seeing the strongest rentals since records began in London, and pretty much the same would say across the UK. Now this chart is actually showing the price appreciation across London going back to 2003. Now the line where we see 0, any bar that's above that means that prices are going up. Any bar below that means that prices are going down. So we can see that over the long term, prices have gone up. Probably the biggest decline in property prices was 2008, 2009, which was when the global financial crisis hit, and prices dropped the greatest they've ever dropped in London and the UK since records began in the 1960s. But we can see there that the drop was only about 17%, which is a lot, but relative to other markets around the world, where I've heard of 30, 40, 50% drops, the UK wasn't hit quite as badly. And we can see within a year or so, it rebounded very strongly. There was another blip around about the 2018, 2019, where prices dropped a little bit. And really this, I believe, was primarily after the Brexit referendum. People were in shock. A lot of people sat on the fence, decided, you know, let's ride out this storm, see what happens to the UK economy. And that did have an impact on the real estate prices. But again, prices dropped by about 2 or 3%. And what we've just seen in the last year or so is, with interest rates rising, we've seen prices across Greater London on average drop by about 2%. Now, I must admit, when interest rates started going up, reading the internet, I've seen these wild predictions of, the worst I saw was the UK property market was going to crash by 30%. Now, again, let's put it in perspective. The greatest drop in prices was in the global financial crisis, when it dropped by about 17%. The reality is that the property prices have dropped by about 2 or 3%. So nothing anywhere near what some people were predicting, which then I think shows the resilience of the real estate industry, that it is something that is a good defensive asset class in times of turmoil. And even then, when we look at the last 3 years, prices of property have gone up in a strong way. And when we look over the medium to long term, over the last 10 years, we've seen a 52% appreciation, and over 20 years, 140% price appreciation. In fact, when I first saw this graph, it absolutely blew me away because it's showing the average price of property across Greater London going back to 1980. So over 40 years. Now, today, the prices are averaging across Greater London at about £575,000. But if you go back to 1980, it's amazing that the average price of a property in London was just £15,000. We see the blip, the biggest blip again in 2008, 2009. That was the global financial crisis. But I really want to emphasize the point here is that we all want to get the best deal, and we'd all love to be able to time the market where we can get in at the bottom of a peak or trough rather, and sell at a peak. But really, when we look at this long-term graph, it's more about not timing the market, but time in the market. And if we are looking at a medium to long-term investment, we can see that the London property market has performed very well. Now, this is the UK average house price index going back to 2020, so just over 20 years. And we can see that back in 2002, the average price of a property across the UK was about 110,000, and today it's hovering closer to about 265,000 pounds. So again, right across the UK, very similar story where we can see overall good steady growth and price appreciation. Now, major factors influencing any industry is supply demand, and two factors that really impact this in the real estate industry is the population growing or is it declining? And what is the supply of property in the market? Is there an oversupply or an undersupply? So when we look at London population, and I could say that the UK is somewhat similar to this, it's growing. And that's a good sign if you're an investor, because it means more housing is required. And with an undersupply, that's putting a greater pressure on. So at the moment, London population is estimated at about 9 million, and it's estimated by 2040 to go up to 10 million. And I have even seen predictions up to 11 million. But even if it was just 1 million, that's an awful lot of additional housing that's required to fulfill this population growth. Now, if we go back 20 years, the local government in London estimated in order to keep up with demand, London developers needed to be building about 30,000 homes every single year. 10 years ago, that figure was adjusted to 43,000 because the situation was getting worse. And more recently, that figure has now been revised up to 52,000. So the overall trend is the fact that the housing supply demand deficit is getting worse rather than better. And the bar chart here is actually showing central London. The zone 1 is prime central London in the brown section of the bar. That's like, for those of you not familiar with the zones, zone 1 is like a bullseye in the center of London. Zone 2 is a concentric circle that wraps around zone 1. And so again, we can see this overall trend in the last sort of 8 years is that the supply of property coming onto the London market is decreasing, again, contributing to this huge deficit. And if we look at in the last year or so of zone 1, right at the right-hand side of the bar chart, we can see that there's been almost zero supply of new build properties coming into prime central zone 1 London. So when we look at rentals across the UK, every single region across the UK has seen rental growth in the last year. The average, when we look at the orange bar, is the average across England, which is showing about 5.5% rental growth. So everywhere across England has seen strong rental growth in the last year. This actually shows the number of properties that are being listed for renting out. And what it's showing is a percentage of lettings agreed at the above asking rent in 2023. So what it's basically doing is, if you had a property and you list it at a certain rent, we can see that every single region across the UK has a certain percentage that is renting at a higher price than what you had asked for. And London, by far ahead, at almost 30% of listings are actually renting out for a higher price than actually was the asking price for that rent. So again, reinforcing right across the country a deficit of rental property. Now let's look at some more macro things. So this is the FX exchange rate between the Singapore dollar and the pound sterling over the last 10 years. This is actually today's rate. It's just over 1.7 Singapore dollars to £1. But we can see if we go back to round about February or 2015, what we suddenly saw was a drop in the exchange rate between the pound sterling and Sing dollar by almost 20% in the space of a year. And this really was the impact of the Brexit referendum, markets being uncertain about the UK and how it was going to come out of the Brexit situation. But you can see since that, it has hovered more or less between about 1.8 to 1.6. There was a minor drop during the Liz, a minor drop, I should say, a major drop for about a week while Liz Truss did her mini budget, and suddenly it went down to about 1.5 Singapore dollars to the pound for a little while. Now, if I extrapolate this even further, I remember selling a property in 2007 in the UK when the exchange rate was 3.15 Singapore dollars to the pound. And again, at about 1.7, that's a 50% swing. So if you are in Singapore and you're fortunate enough to be earning in Singapore dollars, we can see from this graph here that the buying power against the pound sterling means that, you know, depending on how far you go back, you could be looking at almost like a 20 to 50% discount just purely on the exchange rate. Now, interest rates have been a hot topic recently, but this is the Bank of England base rate going back over the last 50 years. And we look at the green section at the far right of the graph, and we can see that for almost 10, 12 years, interest rates were below 1%. In fact, they even dropped to 0.1%, which was the lowest apparently in over 300 years. So my guess is that anyone on the call today who is younger than 40 years old, who's been involved with buying a property, has probably never seen anything until recently but low interest rates. And so that's very often people's expectations. But when we look at the last 50 years, the Bank of England base rate at the moment is 5.25. So if we were drawing a line of 5.25, that would actually be on the low side if we took a median value of what the interest rates have been. In fact, in 1981, the base rate was up at 17%. So again, just putting the interest rates in perspective. Now, the graph on the right-hand side is showing the interest rates in more recent years. And so what we can see is really by middle of 2021, suddenly interest rates have significantly gone up relative to where they were. We look at the graph on the left, these are the inflation rates around the world, and I'm going to focus on the dark green, which is the UK. And again, what we saw during COVID and the Ukraine war is a sudden increase in inflation rates. In fact, the UK got up to almost 11% at its absolute maximum. And one of the main tools that governments use to try and curb inflation is interest rates. And so we can see somewhat of a correlation here, is that as inflation goes up, interest rates lag but follow suit soon afterwards. But interestingly, what we see is that inflation has come down heavily. It seems to be going in the right direction. it appears that the high interest rates are doing the job, and it now appears that the interest rates, at least in the UK, have not been increased for some time. In fact, there is serious belief that in the month of June, the Bank of England might even look at its first reduction in interest rates. But the fact is that now it appears that interest rates have peaked. Banks now feel more confident. They know where the Bank of England base rate is, and more lenders have been coming into the market. And so it brings me nicely onto the next slide, where, we can see that with more lenders coming into the market, we're actually starting to see the first signs of mortgage interest rates starting to decline. Even though the base rate has stayed the same, with banks becoming more confident they know what's happening and more lenders getting into the market wanting to get market share, they're competing against each other and rates have started to come down. In fact, this was an article where it actually says UK mortgage war underway as lenders offers 4.99 fixed rates. Brokers say borrower confidence likely to lift after the first below 5% deal surfaces since June, with more offers likely soon. This other article on the right-hand side from the Financial Times is actually showing the number of building planning approvals by developers across England. And again, what we can see is there is a major trend that has gone downwards, which basically means there are fewer developers applying for planning permission to build a new development. And partly the reason for this is that developers, like a lot of other businesses, do rely on loans. With interest rates going up, labor costs going up, material costs going up, that has all significantly contributed to squeezing the profit margins of developers. So many developers are saying, well, look, let's ride out this, wait until the market conditions improve before we start compiling more land bank to build upon. The problem with that is that I said before, the UK already is chronically undersupplied. And so with the timeline it takes to find a piece of land, acquire the land, get the planning permission, you can easily be looking at a 2 to 4 year time frame. So the point here is that if planning permission applications are significantly down now, it's going to be a few years lag before it catches up, assuming that this happens and starts turning around for the developers now. So there's going to be at least another 2 or 3 years where there's, again, an even worse housing supply across the UK, which is only going to have an impact on the supply-demand deficit, which is potentially going to be driving up rentals and property prices. So what we've seen since the mortgage rates have just shown early signs of coming down is people getting back into the market. On the right-hand side, it says here, London sees a 16% uptick in the number of homes sold as market bounces back, reports Zoopla. Now, for those of you not familiar with Zoopla, it's one of the biggest UK property portals, somewhat similar to like a property guru here in Singapore. And over on the bottom left paragraph, it says, this is due to increased buyer confidence due to new mortgage rates and more realistic pricing from sellers, said the property portal in its latest house price index. Now, this is an article that was in the Singapore Business Times in March this year. And basically, the theme behind it was that UK house hunters are now speeding up plans to beat the price hike. In fact, some 42% of potential home buyers are speeding up their plans, compared with 35% in mid-2023. Basically because they can see that the market seems to be shifting, and rather than taking a wait and see approach and possibly finding that prices have out of their reach, they're starting to get more proactive and get into the market. And this is from Zoopla again reinforcing with actual data about what's happening in buyer demand. So there's been a 4% increase in buyer demand, a 9% increase in number of sales agreed. This is right across the UK, I should say. 11% flow of new supply, and a 20% stock of homes for sale. So people are now putting their property on the market because they do see that there is more buyer activity and interest. So this is a graph showing house price inflation. We could really refer it to, rather than just saying inflation, that anything, again, there's, above the zero, it means prices of properties are going up. Anything below the zero, prices are going down. And so what we can see is that since January 2018 to sort of the middle of year 2023, most of the lines are above, so prices of property are growing. We certainly saw a very strong growth in property prices in about 2022. There were things that were stimulating that, such as a temporary stamp duty holiday. Many people taking advantage of that stamp duty holiday, upgrading to larger properties. During COVID, lots of people were looking at properties with balconies or garden space, and again, upgrading the opportunity with that stamp duty holiday. Interest rates start to kick in. As the interest rates goes up, taking a mortgage becomes less affordable. That means less people are looking to buy a property or invest in a property. So with less buyers in the market, we start to see that prices are starting to soften. They're not going downwards until about 12 months ago. And it's only about 12 months ago that we see the lines going below the zero mark, where we start to see about a 2 or 3% drop in property prices. The black line is London. So again, showing about a 2 to 3% drop. But the interesting thing is that line has now turned. So at the beginning of this year, every single line across every region in the Great Britain, I should say, there is starting to turn, showing signs that we could be on the cusp of a turn in the real estate market. Now, this is an interesting graph. What it shows is 11 snapshots of what happened to property prices after an interest rate hike or an interest rate increase. So the black line shows what happens to prices of property 1 year after the interest rate hike. The silver line is 2 years afterwards, and the brown line is 5 years afterwards. And what we see in every single case, there's a slight blip in October 1994 on that black one, but that's the only time we saw a price go down in the first year. But there is a definite trend here. We've got 11 snapshots showing that actually after an interest rate hike, there is significant growth in property prices across the UK. And my interpretation of this is the fact that when interest rates go up, temporarily people can't afford the mortgage, so they're forced to rent. But when interest rates start to come down, culturally, people in the UK like to own, occupy, and buy their own property. And so as their interest rates come down, you suddenly see a surge in buyer activity and prices spiking. So the data I've just shown you seems to support that we are in a situation where we've seen significant interest rate hikes. It's leveled off. Talk and speculation is that interest rates are going to come down. We can see that people are going back into the market, and potentially, if the data continues the way it has done in history over the next, let's say 2 to 5 years, potentially could see a very strong property price growth. So that brings me to the end of the main part of the presentation. And really, just in summary, what we can see in the data that's been shown tonight is that inflation went up significantly, but it's now well on the way to coming down. In fact, the UK now is, I think, now close to 3%, whereas it did peak at almost 11%. And in line with that, we're starting to see the early signs of mortgage interest rates coming down as banks realize that the Bank of England has probably hit the peak. They know where the market is and are able then to set their prices. And with more lenders in the market, there's competition to get market share. London rents are at an all-time high. So if you are a London landlord, if you're putting it in at market rent, you should be able to get a very strong rent, and it should be snapped up very quickly. The market is chronically undersupplied, and because of the fact that developers are taking a wait-and-see approach in terms of waiting for their overall costs to come down, the supply is going to get worse before it gets better, and so again contributing potentially for prices to rise. Buyers appear to be returning to the market, which is good news. And London, the UK market, looks like, because of this data, it's ready for a strong bounce back. It has been a fairly subdued market for the last 18 to 24 months, but it does look potentially like it's going to be an excellent time to enter the market. So one could say, when looking at where the market is today, if we get some good capital appreciation over the next 2 to 5 years, and although mortgages are still on the high side relative to where they were a few years ago, one strategy could be, well, if I buy an off-plan property, I put maybe a 10–20% deposit down. Over the next 2 or 3 years, I get a strong capital growth, and hopefully by the time it comes to applying for your mortgage in, let's say, 18 months to 2 years, those interest rates have come down. So you've had a double benefit of capital growth and locking in your mortgage, hopefully when those interest rates are at a lower point. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. But what I did want to do was just give those of you tuned in tonight just a quick snapshot of different kinds of investments available in the UK. So just a couple of slides. So I'm just going to give an example. So in London, this is a Zone 2 property. It's called Heathside, and it's a project that is literally just completing. It sits basically between Greenwich, one of the most desirable parts of London, on the south side of the River Thames. So it sits just between Greenwich and Deptford, very close by over to Canary Wharf, which is a very well-known financial centre. And we can see that for a Zone 2 property, these prices are between about 405,000 to 547,000, with estimated gross yields of between almost 4% to 4.7%. And if you were looking at a 70% loan to value, a deposit there would be at about £150,000. So this is, a very good completed property. So there's no developer risk, and again, a very, very good price point for a Zone 2 London property. This is a Birmingham property. It's called Smithfield House. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Birmingham, but there is a massive area called the Smithfield Regeneration Site, where a huge piece of land sitting right next to the city centre, literally about 5–7 minute walk to the Bullring Shopping Centre, which, again, for those of you who know Birmingham, that's slap bang in the middle of Birmingham. It's a major regeneration project. This development is estimated to complete in 2027. So a classic example of, if you wanted to buy something off plan as opposed to something completed, you could be looking at something between 244,000 to 404,000. And we can see here that outside of London, typically we do get stronger yields, and estimated yields based on today's market is between 6.2 to 6.9%. Now, at a 75% loan to value on one of these properties of a purchase price, you could be looking at about £61,000, which is about 100,000 Singapore dollars, which is what I was mentioning before. For every 100,000 Singapore dollars, you could be looking at putting a deposit down and getting a loan for a property. So going back to the SG versus UK, if a second property is going to cost you, for a Singaporean, 750,000, you could be looking at 7 units in a project like this. Let's have a look at a different kind of investment. Now, this may not look too fancy on the outside, but just bear with me for a moment. We're almost finished, but this is actually a UK government guaranteed social housing and supported living. And I found that many people are not familiar with this asset class, but for a certain profile of investor that wants a low risk, high yielding property, I know of no better kind of investment. We can see here the price point for this property is £120,000, so a lot lower, obviously, compared with London, providing a 9% net yield. Now, the interesting thing about this asset class is that the government ultimately is paying the rent. Local government appoints what's called a housing association, and in layman terms, the housing association does everything to manage your property. They not only place vulnerable people in the property, such as mentally or physically handicapped, somebody who may be autistic, it may be somebody who's coming from a domestic violent family and needs to have a roof over their head and get away from a violent situation. So in the UK, being a welfare state, there is actually a law in the UK that if you lose your home or you need a roof over your head, you actually have a legal right and maybe qualify for a free property over your head. Now, unfortunately, there's over 1 million people on the wait list. And so this sector is chronically undersupplied, even worse than the private rental market. But the beauty of this is that as a landlord, you don't have the associated hassles of a landlord. The reason being is the landlord, in this case, the housing association and the government, they pay for all the repair and maintenance. There's no maintenance or service charges. They take 25-year leases with no break clauses, so there's no void periods. Every year, the rent is adjusted upwards based on CPI or inflation, albeit capped at a maximum of 4%. And you basically are the owner of a property, in this case, a freehold property with 3 bedrooms that's been brand newly renovated. And we can see that inside, again, we're not talking Buckingham Palace, but it's brand newly renovated for a person that needs a roof over their head to give them some independence, give them a chance in life to be able to get up on their own 2 feet and get back into society. And when we look at some of the cash flow for these kind of investments, we see here that the purchase price is 120,000. With a 9% net yield, you're looking at a £900 net income. That annual income is just under £11,000. In fact, when you look at the appreciation based on the inflation, we've used a very conservative figure here of an annual compounded growth rate of 2%. Actually, in 10 years' time, the amount of rent that you will have received will actually have paid back the 120,000 purchase price. And if we extrapolate this over the 25-year lease, by year 25, your annual rental will have jumped to over 17,000. Your total rent received over 25 years, again, based on a 2% compounded increase each year, would be 345,000, almost 346,000 pounds. So these are great properties, I find, for people who want good income generation. If somebody, let's say, for example, is close to retirement or in retirement and wants a very low risk, high yielding property where they can get a much stronger yield than traditional property investments, then something that is well worth considering. And lastly, for those of you who know me, you may know that I've been heavily involved in the past in developer financing. And I took that experience and I worked with a handful of developers who have alternative ways to raise funds through individual investors. And in return, they provide very attractive returns. So these are fixed income bonds where you are effectively lending money to an experienced developer. None of the developers I work with have less than 20 years of experience. Some of them are 30 years of experience. Investment quantums, depending on which bond you go into, can start from £10,000 to 25,000. Some of the bonds can be done in over 27 currencies, which includes the Singapore dollar. Unlike buying a property, you don't have any legal fees. You don't have to do the conveyancing or apply for a mortgage. So the paperwork is very simple. There's no charges in terms of legal fees. As a Singapore resident or a Malaysian resident, you don't get taxed on interest. So effectively, they're non-taxable. And even when you exit after the 1-year term, again, there's no exit fees as well. So 100% of your cash is working for you. You can be paid returns of between 12, 15, and even up to 17%. If you choose for a 12%, it's typically paid at 1% per month. If you take a 15% annualized return, it's paid at 7.5%, paid every 6 months. And there is one that pays 17%, where the interest coupon is paid at the end of the 12-month term. So again, I've just shared this with you just really to give a little flavor of different kinds of investments, seeing that we're covering the UK. And I wanted to share for those of you who've not seen some alternative investments that it's not necessarily about only buying from a developer or buying a new build property or an off-plan property. There are lots of other different kinds of investments. And I've just shown a handful. There are a lot of other different kinds of ones as well. So that brings me now to the end of today's presentation. I hope you found that useful. What I would like to encourage is there is a chat box. Hopefully it's at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And what I'd like to do is encourage some questions to come in. I haven't had a chance to read as I've been speaking, but I'm just going to have a look. I see that there are some points in here. Let me start reading them, and I hope I can answer these. What has happened to the UK property market after interest rate hikes in the past? So I think we've covered that. Where are the UK mortgage interest rates heading? I think maybe this is my colleagues putting this in, some of the key points that we are covering today. So that's not so much a question. I can see they've even put my signature at the bottom. So thank you for that. So please feel free to fire away with any questions, and I'll be delighted to do my very best to answer your questions. Please go ahead. Maybe while some of you are thinking, and please don't be shy, because very often when one starts, then we get a snowball effect of other questions. It is a whole nother seminar, but buying a property in your personal name compared with your buying through a company structure can be a very important decision. And especially for people who've got other properties in their personal name, it doesn't take too long, especially if you've got multiple properties in London, to be starting to go from an income tax of 20% to up to 40%. Buying property through a company structure can have a lot of benefits. You can offset all your expenses, and one of the biggest expenses would be the interest. When selling a property in the future, if it's bought through a company structure, then you are effectively selling the company. You're not going through a property transaction that would attract stamp duty. And insofar, when you sell that property, the next buyer wouldn't be paying stamp duty. So very often what we've said is, if the stamp duty had been, let's say, £20,000, you put the price of the property up by £10,000, so you profit an extra 10,000, and the buyer basically saves £10,000. So both people win-win. There is a company now that has digitized the ability to buy UK buy-to-let property through a platform, and because of that platform base, it's now about 10 times cheaper to buy a property through a company structure, so that even one of these social housing properties, I have many clients that have actually bought through a company structure for a whole variety of reasons, but it still makes commercial sense, even with an inexpensive property. So just sort of sharing a little bit about food for thought, something like 65% of investment property in the UK now is done through a company structure. And this is partly because of this company that's digitized the ability to buy it at a fraction of the cost. And once you're onboarded as a client, they can set up the sales and purchase agreement literally within a few minutes. So it's time efficient and it's very cost efficient as well. Okay, I'm not sure if I've bombarded you with too much and I've confused everyone so far. I don't see any questions unless I'm missing something. Oh, we have a question. Thank you. Thank you, Henny. You're getting the ball rolling. So Henny's asking, what kind of services that your company Turnkey Investments provide to investors from Singapore? I saw that you mentioned investment through bond. Are you helping to purchase property? Well, what I did at the end was just share with you several different kinds of investments in the UK. Most people, all they get exposed to is buying what I call a traditional property investment. They buy a property off a developer, they hold the property, they get a rental income, and hopefully over the medium to long term, they get a capital growth and make a handsome profit. I showed the social housing property, which is you're still buying a property, but you don't have some of the headaches of being a landlord because the housing association, which is managing your property, pays for all the repair and maintenance. There's no void periods, no service charges, and the rent's adjusted upwards every year. And you've got long leases of 25 years with no break clauses. So effectively, you own the asset, which goes up over time. You basically get paid a monthly rental at a 9% net yield per annum, but it's paid every month. And really, there's nothing that you need to do in terms of maintaining repair and maintenance, void periods, changeovers, and so on. The bond, though, is an investment that you are not owning the property. And I do have clients that say, well, you know, I've built up quite a significant property. It's actually taking more time these days. And I'd rather have something that's a little less hands-on. And so this is lending money to a developer who's then using those funds to buy land. Typically, one of the developers I work with, they only focus on distressed and undervalued properties. Their profit margins is much bigger, but you are effectively lending money to an experienced developer, and in return, they pay you back for that loan anywhere between 12 to 17% over a 1-year term. So just think of it as a simple loan to a developer. You're not owning the property, but you're getting a 12 to 17% annualized return. And it's a shorter term, it's 1 year. You're not looking typically at holding a property, you might be looking at a medium to long term of 5 to 10 years. So if you like real estate as the underlying asset, but you'd also like to invest in something which is shorter term, you can review it each year. I found that these have proved very, very popular. I hope I've answered that question, Henny. If not, stick in another question and I'll expand on it. So Matt, for the social housing, do I have flexibility to sell whenever I want? And does it have to be sold as low cost housing? Okay, good question. So the answer is yes, you can sell this whenever you like. You are the owner of the property and you can sell that whenever you wish. I will be doing another seminar on social housing again later this year. But one of the things about the leases with social housing, they're called FRI commercial leases. That means FRI is full repair and insurance lease. It's a little bit like a lease if you were a commercial business. So if you were Starbucks renting, let's say, from Capital Land Building, it would be a commercial lease where the tenant has to do all the repair and maintenance. The landlord typically doesn't have to do that. When you have a 25-year lease, effectively with the housing association, where ultimately the government is your tenant, you have a very strong lease. And actually, the valuation of a property that is being used for social housing with the strength of the FRI commercial lease will actually give it a higher valuation compared with if the same property was rented out in the private rental market without the FRI lease, it would have a lower valuation in that case. But coming back to your question, yes, you can sell it whenever you want. So you are just as flexible in that respect. You can sell it whenever you want. However, the developer I work with will give an option to buy back the property within 3 years at a 10% appreciation, which basically means if you're getting a 9% net yield over 3 years, that would be 27% in yield plus a 10% buyback would give you a 37% return over a 3-year period, which is just under 13% per annum. So again, if you want to own property without the associated challenges and burdens of being a landlord, then the social housing has proved, again, very, very popular. Okay. I think that's answered that question, Matt. Any other questions? I do notice that we've just run over the hour time, but I appreciate, I'll definitely stay on if there are some other questions. Just so you're aware as well, although I don't provide property management, I do provide a complete end-to-end service. So if you're a client that's never invested overseas, and in this case the UK, then I appreciate that very often the fear of the unknown can be a perceived barrier to entry. So my role is not only to educate clients so that they can make a well-informed decision of whether this is the right investment, but to guide them through. So if you're buying a traditional property, that would include, first of all, understanding you as a client, what your investment goals are, your risk appetite, and then reviewing what will be the best kind of investment to achieve or surpass your goals. Then if you're investing into a traditional property, once you've decided which one to invest in, then linking it with the lawyers to get the conveyancing done, introducing you to a mortgage broker if you're going to financing to apply for a mortgage, helping with furniture packs, and then if it's an off-plan property, when it comes to completion, introducing you to a property management company who will do a handover from the developer. They'll market your property, find a tenant, manage the property, they will collect the rent, and many of them will even do a resale. So it will really go the full cycle from beginning to the exit of your investment. So it's a complete turnkey service to help investors hold your hand through the whole process, especially if it's your first time doing so. Okay, I don't know if there's going to be any more questions. You can see my contact details on the last slide there. The way I do like to work is about building a relationship with a client. So if I've not met you before, I'd really encourage you, and we would love to reach out to you. And if you're in Singapore, meet face to face. In that way, it's all about building a relationship, building trust, building credibility, understanding you as a client, what your investment goals are, what your risks and risk appetite is, so that rather than just putting a product in front of you and hoping that that's the right kind of investment, really reverse engineering it to clearly understand where you are today, what you're wanting to achieve, where the exit is for you, so that we can really make a strategy and a plan. So if you like real estate as part of your investment portfolio, we can look at a wide variety of different kind of real estate investments to ensure that whichever season of life you're in, you look at the best kind of real estate investment to suit where you are in life. Great. Okay. Well, it's 9 minutes past 9. We've got a few links that have been put in there. So if you want to just click on any of those links, I have obviously a website for Turnkey Investments. I have my own YouTube channel with lots of educational webinars that I've done in the past. Also some social media, Facebook and LinkedIn there. So thanks guys for just sharing the various websites and so on. So if there's no other questions, thank you again very much for spending the time tonight out of your busy schedule. And again, please do reach out if you'd like to have a chat, whether that's via Zoom or a face-to-face meeting. So thank you and good night.